stand on an Australian beach at night, with black water breathing against the sand, and the strangest thing is what has vanished beneath it. This is the mystery of Aboriginal oral traditions of drowned Ice Age coastlines, swallowed by rising seas along Australia's shores, and by the end, that flat, dark sea will no longer feel like an edge of the map. It will feel like a covered archive. About 20,000 years ago, after the last glacial maximum, the world began to warm. Ice that had locked away huge amounts of water melted back into the oceans. Sea levels rose roughly 120 meters. Around Australia, that meant the shoreline people know today was not the old shoreline at all. The continental shelf, now hidden under waves, had once been dry land in many places. Picture that for a moment. Not a small beach shifted by a storm, whole plains, river mouths, walking routes, hunting grounds, places where smoke may have lifted from campfires, where children may have learned the names of rocks, winds, tides, and animals. Then, generation by generation, the rising sea came in. The unsettling part is that some of those losses may still be remembered. Researchers Reid and Nunn documented 21 Aboriginal oral traditions from around Australia that describe coastlines, islands, and lands that were once dry, but now lie under the sea. These accounts predate written records, and the disturbing thing, if you are used to history being locked in paper, is that geology independently confirms the broad events they describe. The exact date of each account is still uncertain. That matters. But the larger question is harder to put away. How long can a people remember a coastline after the coastline is gone? Because one of these drowned places was not just a beach. It was a bridge to Tasmania. And when the water took it, an entire human world was cut off for millennia. If stories like this are your kind of mystery, subscribe before we go under that water. To understand why that bridge matters, you have to forget the outline of Australia you know from school maps. During the coldest stretch of the last ice age, the coast sat far beyond many of today's beaches. In some places, a person standing on what is now dry land would have looked out across open country instead of open water. The air would have been sharper. The wind would have carried dust, salt, animal smell, and smoke from country that is now sealed under the sea. That is the part modern maps hide from us. They show the present shoreline as if it has always been the border. But the old border was lower, wider, and farther out. The continental shelf was exposed in broad areas around the continent, turning today's shallow seas into plains, valleys, and corridors. Then the ocean began to return. It was slower, stranger, and in some ways more haunting. A camp near the coast might still be usable for one generation, damp and risky for the next, and gone by the time their grandchildren were old enough to ask where the old people used to walk. Shell beds shifted, fresh water turned brackish, sandbars became islands, islands became distant shapes, then even those shapes disappeared. Reid and Nunn looked at Aboriginal oral traditions with that physical background in mind. They were asking whether a remembered place matched a real drowned coastline. It is a very different question. Because if a tradition says, people once walked across land where the sea now lies, geology can test whether that land was actually exposed when the sea was lower. If it says an island was once joined to the mainland, the seafloor can be checked. If it speaks of water coming over country, the timing can be compared with known sea level rise. And one place on the map gives this question a cold, hard edge. The flooded plain between mainland Australia and Tasmania. Before it vanished, people could cross it on foot, until the rising sea closed the path behind them. That flooded plain is one of the clearest ways to feel the scale of what the old stories are pointing toward. Today, Bass Strait looks final. Cold water, hard wind, grey swells moving between Victoria and Tasmania. On a rough day, the sea seems as if it has always belonged there. It slaps against rock, pulls at kelp, and fills the air with that metal smell of salt and weather. But during the lower sea levels, that same space held the Bassian Plain. It was dry enough to cross. A broad land bridge linking Tasmania to the mainland. People could move across it. Animals could move across it. Country continued where water now cuts the map in two. Then, roughly 14,000 years ago, the flooding reached the point where that crossing was gone. Think about what that means in human terms. The last people who crossed may not have known they were the last. A route that had been known through grandparents, camps, tracks, and teaching places slowly became harder, wetter, more broken. Channels opened, low ground vanished first, higher patches became islands, and eventually the old path was no longer a path at all. After that, Tasmania's people were isolated from the mainland for millennia. This is where Aboriginal coastal memory stops being an abstract question and becomes something almost physical. It can be a memory of separation, of relatives no longer reachable, of country becoming distant, then silent, then unreachable, except through speech, song, and teaching. Researchers can map the drowned ground. They can date the broad sea level change. They can show that the land bridge existed and that it flooded. But no core sample can tell us what it felt like when people first understood the crossing had closed. And if one remembered shoreline can match the shape of the seafloor, the next question is even more difficult. How many other coastal stories are holding pieces of a map we can no longer walk? The number 21 matters. The accounts they examined came from different parts of Australia's rim, separated by long distances, different languages, different local histories, and different stretches of sea. Some spoke of land that used to lie offshore. Some described islands that had once been joined to the mainland. Others remembered the ocean advancing over places where people had moved, lived, or crossed. You can hear the same kind of unease inside many of them. A place is named, a boundary changes, water comes in where people say land used to be. The modern listener hears story, the geologist looks at the seafloor and finds a shape that makes the story difficult to dismiss. That does not mean every account is simple. They carry lore, warning, family memory, spiritual meaning, and practical knowledge in the same breath. A coastline may be remembered through an ancestral event. A channel may appear inside a teaching about conduct. A reef or island may be tied to a story that also tells people how to live properly on country. But that mix is exactly why these traditions matter. Long before written records on this continent, Aboriginal communities were passing down detailed knowledge of place. As part of life, where to go, what to avoid, who belonged where, what happened when the world changed. The sound of it would not have been a lecture. It would have been voice, rhythm, repetition, children listening close, old people pointing out toward water that covered older ground, and then comes the part that makes the skin tighten a little. If even some of these stories preserve real observations of sea level rise after the Ice Age, then Australia may hold memories from a time so deep that most cultures have no direct record of it at all. Researchers have suggested some could reach back across as many as 400 generations, which raises a problem almost no archive on Earth is built to answer. The problem is time. 400 generations is a number so large it almost stops meaning anything. In ordinary family talk, a great-grandparent can already feel distant. Names fade, places get renamed, a path used every day becomes a road, then a memory, then nothing at all. Most modern people would struggle to repeat one detailed account unchanged across 5 generations, let alone Hundreds. Aboriginal knowledge lived in country. It lived in country, in repeated speech, in song, in ceremony, in rules about who could tell which part, and in the physical act of teaching place. They learned it while standing near water, smelling wet sand, hearing wind cut through grass, watching an elder point to a headland, a reef, a gap, a stretch of sea that carried a name. These traditions can make modern researchers uneasy in the best possible way. They force a different idea of memory. Memory as a system guarded by many people, repeated because it matters, corrected because place matters, and carried because forgetting could cost something. Still, no serious researcher can pretend the chain is simple. Words shift, languages change, meanings gather new layers. A story about an advancing sea might hold practical observation, law, warning, and sacred history together. That makes it powerful, and it also makes it difficult to date with clean confidence. So the careful position is this: some of these accounts may preserve accurate observation from a very deep past, possibly across those hundreds of generations. The broad events are backed by geology. The exact age of each spoken account remains uncertain, and yet uncertainty cuts both ways, because when a tradition says the sea covered land and the sea floor shows that land was there, the question stops being, can oral memory last that long? It becomes something more uncomfortable. What other old records have been sitting in plain hearing, waiting for science to catch up? That is where the investigation becomes careful, almost quiet. A researcher cannot walk into a community, hear an old coastal account, and simply pin a date to it like a label on a museum shelf. The story has to be treated with respect, and the land beneath the water has to be treated with patience. So, the work moves between voices and maps, between remembered place and measured depth. One part of it is physical. If an account speaks of land where water now lies, scientists can look at the shape of the seabed. Modern depth charts can show whether a shallow shelf, valley, ridge, or old passage would have been exposed when sea levels were lower. The numbers do not tell the whole story, but they can say whether the setting is possible. Another part is timing. Sea level curves show how water rose after the Ice Age, though not every coast changed at the same speed or in the same shape. A low plain might drown early, a higher ridge might survive longer as an island, a channel might open slowly, first as wet ground, then as a tidal gap, then as a permanent stretch of sea. This is why the oral traditions examined by Reid and Nunn are so striking. They are not just vague claims that things were different long ago. Many are tied to particular coastal changes, land becoming sea, islands separating, passages opening, familiar country being covered. And here, the tone has to stay honest. Scientific comparison does not take ownership of the stories. It does not turn them into laboratory specimens. It simply shows that two very different records, one spoken and one geological, can point toward the same vanished ground. If you have ever stood on a beach at dusk, with your feet sinking into cold sand while the tide creeps up around your ankles, you already know how quietly water can remove certainty. Now, imagine trying to prove that someone remembered that movement after the place itself had been under the ocean for thousands of years. Proof is difficult because the sea did not cover empty space. Under parts of Australia's present shoreline were places people used. You have to imagine old river bends now filled with salt water, shellfish grounds shifted into deeper channels, freshwater soaks turning brackish, and low camps slowly becoming wet sand. The wind would still have moved through grass. Birds would still have called over flats at dawn. Fires would still have left ash in the soil. Then the line of water moved. For a family living through it, the change may have been slow enough to deny for a while and fast enough to hurt. A fishing place still worked until it did not. A path across low ground still carried people until the tide made it dangerous. A hill became an island became a shape on the horizon. After that, only the name remained, held in the mouth. The oral traditions matter beyond their age. They preserve the idea that country was changed and that people had to understand that change in order to survive inside it. In many Aboriginal traditions, knowledge of place is tied to responsibility. A story can tell you where water came in, while also telling you how people should behave, who belongs to a place, and what happens when law is broken. To an outside listener, that can sound hard to separate. To the people who carry it, the layers belong together. The layered form is exactly what makes the accounts powerful and exactly what makes them hard for science to handle neatly. A sediment sample can show that a coast retreated. A depth map can show where land once stood. But a spoken account can hold the cost of that retreat. The loss of a crossing, the change in food, the warning attached to a dangerous place, the reason a certain stretch of water is treated with care. And once you accept that, the next question becomes sharper. When researchers compare story to seabed, where does confirmation end and where does interpretation begin? The boundary between confirmation and interpretation is where the mystery has to be handled with clean hands. There is a careless version of this story that would say every coastal tradition is a perfect recording from the Ice Age. That sounds exciting, but it goes further than the evidence allows. There is another careless version that waves the accounts away because they were spoken instead of written. That is easier for modern habits and just as wrong. The stronger position sits in the middle where the ground is less comfortable. The sea did rise. The shelf around Australia was drowned. The Bassian Plain did flood, and Tasmania's people were cut off for thousands of years. Those facts are not waiting on belief. They are written in depth charts, sediments, coastal forms, and the shape of the seabed. The oral traditions are the part that makes those facts feel watched. They matter. They can be alive, layered, sacred, practical, and historical at the same time. A story may hold the memory of a shoreline retreat, while also carrying rules, identity, warning, and meaning that no outside method can fully pull apart. Exact dating remains difficult. A tradition may refer to a real event that happened thousands of years before writing arrived, but the form in which it is told today has passed through generations of language, ceremony, loss, care, and change. The core can survive while the surface shifts, and yet the match still matters. When different coastal accounts describe land now underwater, and geology shows that those places could once have been dry, the old habit of calling spoken history unreliable starts to look thin. Paper can burn, stone can break. A voice, repeated with purpose, can sometimes outlast both. But there is one more turn, because if ancient coastal memory can carry the shock of a rising sea, then today's shorelines may be the beginning of another record, forming while people are still standing there, watching the water move. This makes the old coastal accounts feel less distant than they should. Stand on a modern Australian shore after a king tide, and the signs are small at first. A step cut into a dune, a tree with roots showing where sand used to hold it, a track that ends closer to the water than older people remember. The sound is ordinary enough. Waves folding, gulls calling, wind moving through grass. But the feeling under it is not ordinary. The edge is moving. That does not mean today's change is the same as the great post-Ice Age flooding. The scale, speed, and causes have to be discussed carefully, but the human experience has an echo. People notice when a beach narrows. They notice when a fishing spot changes. They notice when a place that held family visits, names, teaching and memory starts to feel less secure underfoot. Now go back to those older traditions. The accounts studied by Reid and Nunn matter because they suggest that coastal change was remembered. Shaped, guarded, and handed forward, the sea came in, and people made that movement part of knowledge because it told later generations how country could change and why paying attention mattered. There is something almost unsettling in that. Modern science arrives with charts, cores, sonar, models, and dates. It measures the old sea level rise and maps the submerged land. Then, on the shore, there are spoken records that seem to have kept watch from another direction entirely. You do not have to choose one over the other. The power is in the meeting. Still, the meeting is incomplete. Some accounts line up strongly with known coastal change. Others are harder to place. Some may hold very old observation. Some may have gathered later meanings around an older core. Exact dating remains uncertain. Uncertainty leaves the final image unresolved. When we look out across calm water today, are we seeing empty sea or the surface of a story still being told from underneath? So the final answer is a meeting of records. On one side, the seafloor, the drowned shelf, the old land bridge to Tasmania, and the known rise of roughly 120 meters after the last ice age. On the other side, spoken accounts carried through Aboriginal communities long before written archives reached these shores. 21 of those traditions were documented by Nick Reid and Patrick Nunn, and many describe the same kind of world geology now confirms: land where sea lies today. Not every detail is easy, it should not. The exact dating of each account remains uncertain. Some stories may hold very ancient observation, some may have changed shape as they were carried forward, some may join memory, lore, warning and sacred meaning so tightly that pulling them apart would damage what they are. But the old dismissal no longer works. A voice can remember what a shoreline forgot to show. A name can stay attached to a place after waves have covered the stones. A crossing can vanish from the map and still remain in instruction, ceremony, and story. Here is the quiet force of these traditions. They ask for care because they may be among the deepest records of environmental change anywhere on Earth. Return now to the beach where this began. The tide is lower. Small pools shine between dark rocks. Somewhere beyond the break, under water that looks blank from shore, there may be old ground. A valley floor, a track, a camp place, a line once walked by people who watched the sea come in. A crab moves through a pool and leaves a mark in the sand. The next wave softens it, but does not prove it was never there. If this story changed the way you look at the Australian coast, leave a comment with the place it made you think of, and subscribe for more strange, ancient, and unresolved corners of this country.